This video aims to explore a source for the Napoleon case study with a general focus on the debate regarding Napoleon's influence on France and Europe, but I think it also maps onto the extent of Napoleonic reform debate. And the source that we're looking at is this individual here, Emmanuel De Las Casas, and his book, The Memorial from the Island of St. Helena, published right after Napoleon's death in the early 1820s. What we're trying to do here is work with the syllabus, pages 12 and 13, to develop a detailed understanding of the source and how it contributes to the changing interpretations of Napoleonic history. Remembering that we're really asked to consider a number of things here: the availability of evidence, the context of historians, how they approached constructing history, and the changing philosophies of history over time. And we're being asked to discuss in the exam a number of interpretations. So we're being asked to discuss the breadth of the topic, and I've suggested in previous videos a basic start to this might be to think of Napoleonic historiography as going through about four main phases. But also, in addition to covering some breadth of the topic, we're being asked to look at some sources in detail and show that we understand how they were produced and why they led to differing interpretations. And that's what I'm suggesting here, is that we need to pick off, if we've got thousands of interpretations of Napoleon, we need to pick a few of them that we can see as representative of some of the major changes that have taken place in this debate. So that's what we're trying to do, and you might think of De Las Casas is an important source for the most early phase of Napoleonic history, so it's relevant to this first phase here. And I think it's a very emblematic text for a number of reasons. How do we get the depth in this? Well, we really have to just go back to the syllabus and try to unpack the source using a range of the insights that the syllabus helps us think about, but also just trying to think about the source on its own terms. But we need to think about things like who the historian actually is. Who is Emmanuel De Las Casas? What was he trying to achieve? And how did he actually make his work? How did he produce the history that we're working with? And why did that lead him to particular conclusions? So let's start with the historian himself. Who is Emmanuel De Las Casas? Well, basically, he's a French official who had close ties with Napoleon. He had military training in France. He had served in the French Navy, and he had various titles. So he's a French elite. He also served Napoleon with great dedication. So he served Napoleon during his time in power, but he also, after Napoleon's first defeat, fled France and then returned for Napoleon's 100 Days. And then also, I think some of the most important points about De Las Casas' story is that he then went on to live with Napoleon on St. Helena during his exile from 1815 to 21. And in fact, this is the context in which he really wrote the book. So his long-standing commitment to Napoleon is clear, but it's also, another anecdote that might help us understand this is that his son, De Las Casas' son, even helped bring Napoleon's body back from France in 1841 when it was repatriated. He was part of that group. So there's a long-standing connection between De Las Casas. Many people actually talk about De Las Casas as being an important source in the foundation of Bonapartism. Basically, that political philosophy that looked favorably on enlightened despotism. So basically the type of rule that Napoleon Bonaparte had, in a sense, enabled, or at least represented, I should say, during his rule. So De Las Casas has an important connection to the subject. The book that we're talking about is The Memorial from the Island of St. Helena. It's published in 1822-23, series of volumes that runs over 2,000 pages, right in close conjunction to Napoleon's death, and also to, obviously, Napoleon's rule. So what we're talking about in terms of the context is that this book was actually written on the island of St. Helena, hence the title, The Memorial from the Island, which is the small island in the Atlantic that Napoleon was banished to and De Las Casas lived with him on. So what we can say more about the context, I think, is that it's written in the context of the recent demise of Napoleon's empire from 1815, okay, and his arrest and exile. Now, what I think that suggests as well to us is that there's an obvious concern in the book to frame the legacy of Napoleon. So this was written in the context, or Napoleon's rule was really, it brought about a state of many wars, actually, the creation of the empire, Napoleonic reform. There are many things that were happening during the Napoleonic time, and it was quite disruptive, and people were trying to think about whether it was good, bad, what were the positives and negatives and so on. And there was a big, essentially, public social debate about this. And so, for example, many British people saw Napoleon as quite negative, partly because they were Napoleon's greatest enemies. Not everyone, but many groups in British society saw Napoleon as a great threat to Britain, therefore they wrote him off as negative. Obviously, De Las Casas is weighing in on this debate about how Napoleon should be remembered, and he's arguing that basically Napoleon should be remembered as a great figure who did positive things for France and also for Europe. So he's part of that social debate in the early days. It's also important to note that the book itself was developed in conjunction with Napoleon. It's not a dictation. It's not De Las Casas sitting down and listening to Napoleon tell him what to write and just writing it verbatim. It's basically built out of conversations with Napoleon. So De Las Casas, you could think of him as talking to Napoleon, interview him. They're both discussing what they understand as the great legacy of Napoleon, and he recorded a lot of this. So it's more, in a sense, like a memoir than a history where De Las Casas has sat down and tried to test sources. He hasn't done that. What he's done is he's tried to sit down and capture what Napoleon was saying about his rule, but his voice is obviously part of the process as well. So what are the aims and purposes of the memorial? Starting to get a bit more detailed in our analysis of the source. Well, I think it's partly to preserve the legacy of Napoleon. That's obviously on the agenda. It's also fairly obvious, both from De Las Casas' own life and also from the book, that the memorial is underwritten by a kind of an assumption of Anglophobia. That is that for the disruption that Napoleon caused on the wars and all of that sort of stuff, De Las Casas actually blamed England for trying to, in a sense, crush the French as their opposition to ensure their own superiority. And he was blaming the British for actually being quite disruptive in this period. So there's an underwritten kind of anti-English sentimentality here, which works as part of the argument in favor of Napoleon. I think it's also partly, maybe a slightly less important motive here, is that it's also partly a personal defense. Remember, De Las Casas is a main participant here. So his life, in a sense, had been very much aligned with Napoleon's, so he was interested to a degree in sort of justifying to some extent what Napoleon had done. So many people therefore talk about this as a hagiography, and I think to some degree that's a reasonable idea. It's basically the whole point of a hagiography is to write a fairly glowing portrayal of an individual rather than, say, a balanced biography. Your purpose in a hagiography is to set out to basically write a positive recount of somebody's life. And as I've suggested, because it's influential to the development of Bonapartism, that should say, or Bonapartist philosophy, I think we can see that that's kind of how it functions as a text. Peter Guile, one of the great French scholars of all of these works, argued about the memorial that the whole work, the whole book or the whole set of books glows with the glory which surrounds Napoleon even in his fall. So even in the exile, De Las Casas is trying to represent Napoleon as a dignified and important figure. So it glows with the glory which surrounds him even in his fall, and which the people of France share with him, that glory. So the glory of France is is the thought which he consistently returns, and what he did for France. So this is Napoleon as the kind of servant of the French people in his analysis. That's what Guile thinks of the work. So let's have a little bit more of a think about how the text was actually constructed and put together, and how that might affect its meaning. Well, we've already noted that it's based upon basically the source material, if you want to put it that way, is interviews, conversations, and personal recollections. So this is a very personally involved text. The author is very close to the subject in this case, and there's a mixture of voices here. Napoleon's voice being written down, but also De Las Casas trying to remember things as well along the way. And in fact, many people talk about him as being quite, let's say, creative in this process. So Guile again points out that the book is actually quite anecdotal. There's just lots of little stories in there, not necessarily stories that are analysed in great kind of intellectual depth, but just stories that are put into the book. It can be quite random. It doesn't follow a sort of sequential argument, and in many cases quite speculative. So it's not using evidence and staying within the bounds of evidence. It's kind of fairly opinionated as a text. I think another important point here is that many people accept that now that the book is actually based on fabricated, not entirely, but parts of the book. And they might only be small parts, but this is important. Small parts of the book are based on fabricated documents. So these are included in the book in places, but people have kind of figured out that this is actually De Las Casas making some things up to make Napoleon look a little better than he was. So I think this is an important point. In the process of constructing this history, De Las Casas is not doing the job of what we might think of a von Runkian historian doing, and that is arranging some source material, testing it, and analyzing it for what is, reliable and useful in the context. So I think it's better to think of it not as a kind of academic, intellectual, historical inquiry, but as a memoir or hagiography. And that positions the text in a particular way that I think is a bit more helpful to think of it as. It's also important to point out that it's incredibly lengthy. I mean, this is full of anecdotes. It's full of opinions and so on about the topic. There's lots of information in it, but as we've just seen, much of it is also questionable. In terms of the claims and ideas in this, I think it's reasonable to, without oversimplifying it, really draw this down to two big themes within the book in terms of this idea of Napoleon's influence on France and Europe. A couple of the big ideas are that Napoleon was an agent of necessary change, that change needed to take place in both France and Europe, and Napoleon was the person to actually make that happen. So you can already see the very specifically positive claims that he's making. And also, generally, I think he is trying to argue that Napoleon is, more broadly speaking, a force for good in history, or was a force for good in history. So in terms of being an agent for change and necessary change, one of the things that De Las Casas is really strong on is the idea that Napoleon contributed importantly to the destruction of the ancient regime. That is, he took up the French Revolution's attempt to rearrange French society along more enlightened, modern, you might even say democratic and humanist lines, and he actually helped to do that, removing the privilege of the old classes, destroying the aristocracy, destroying the monarchy, and allowing people, establishing a more meritocratic society where people could actually advance through society depending on their skill and ability. So I think this is also read as a stimulant in De Las Casas' view that Napoleon's change stimulated important change across Europe, because remember, the empire is spreading Napoleonic ideals. That's at least De Las Casas' view. So he's doing the same thing, reforming France, but also reforming the parts of the empire that come under his control. In terms of being generally a force for good, De Las Casas rests on the general idea that Napoleon only made war for the sake of peace, and therefore he was actually a stabilizing influence. How does he actually justify this? Well, what he's saying is this is part of the Anglophobia, that other powers were actually trying to, in a sense, expand their control, and Napoleon was trying to resist that. So this is actually Napoleon challenging the overruling power of groups like Russia and also like Britain and so on. And what he's arguing is that when Napoleon made war, the ultimate conclusion of it was not greater destruction, but peace. And that was his argument, that Napoleon actually therefore can be seen as a general force for good rather than just disruption. And the result of this is that through the creation of the empire, Napoleon actually brought some kind of order to the chaotic space of Europe. You got all of these competing little societies and groups of people all over Europe, and Napoleon brought them under one, not all of them, but many of them under one general kind of figure, or the rule of one state. So he turned a period of chaos, and tradition into one of order and more progress towards modernity. That's the argument of De Las Casas. So you might think of this in another way. De Las Casas is obviously mourning the decline of Napoleon rather than celebrating it, thinking that Napoleon's defeat and exile was a horrible thing because it brought an end to all of this, which is an important point. Here's just one example of the kinds of things that De Las Casas has Napoleon saying along these lines. So in a quote from Napoleon recorded by De Las Casas, this apparently came from the 11th of November 1816, so the year after his conquer, and they're discussing the issue of this idea of Napoleon's contribution to the European wars. And Napoleon says to De Las Casas, well, my enemies always spoke of my love of war, but was I not constantly engaged in self-defense? So he's suggesting that people were attacking Napoleon, and the fact that Napoleon kept going to war was merely a resistance to that. So again, it's this defensive kind of I'm being attacked by old regressive traditional forces. The old kings and queens of Europe are marshalling against me, whereas I'm trying to actually preserve the progress that I'm making. Okay, in terms of evaluating the source, a couple of things that are important here. One, I think the evidence, this is a good source for the evidence of the divisive nature of Napoleon's rule. This is this legend versus black legend dichotomy that Jeffrey Ellis talks about in his book Profiles of Power about Napoleon. And he argues that basically there were two dominant views of Napoleon, extremely polarized, very positive and extremely negative. Napoleon being very divisive in this case. Obviously, De Las Casas fits on this side of describing Napoleon as a kind of a legend, so an important and positive figure of history. I also think the book is an important reminder and maybe important evidence, I suppose, of the powerful role that political ideology and personal context have played in this debate. It's pretty clear that from his personal context and his own beliefs, De Las Casas is kind of almost constrained to draw out this conclusion of Napoleon being a great figure for the good of France and Europe. And this is not because De Las Casas has gone into the source material, analyzed it really thoroughly, and entered into a discussion with other historians and come to the conclusion that, yes, Napoleon was good. It's basically because he was part of it and he believed in Napoleon and he wanted, his motive was to preserve some kind of positive view of the emperor. I think we also need to see it very obviously as fundamentally opposed to those black legend interpretations. Madame de Stael, Chateaubriand, that's pretty clear. That's not a great enlightening point. I also think this is maybe a little bit more out of left field. It's probably a great example of what we might think of as early popular history. This is a hagiography. It was meant to be read by the public. It was not an academic work designed for historians to test and advance the claims of history. This was really designed for a public consumption to defend the emperor. Do you call that a popular history? Well, I do. So I think of it as an early form of popular history, which is interesting. Perhaps there are some similarities here between the kinds of things that some people say in the modern world and what some people have said back in the earliest days of Napoleonic history, suggesting that not everything about this debate is different. Napoleon still seems to be very divisive. In terms of where it's relevant, I think it's obviously relevant for the impact in France of Europe and on Napoleon's impact on France and Europe debate. It obviously, in sum, argues that Napoleon's rule brought progress and order to France and Europe, restored some glory to France, and therefore was essentially good and positive. So that was his impact in summary. In terms of the extent of Napoleonic reform debate, I think it's also relevant. He's suggesting that Napoleon carried forward the best ideals of the French Revolution in wide-sweeping reforms for the people of France and Europe. So I think, and the main evidence of that, I think that's important to emphasize here, is the destruction of the ancient regime. That is, that the reform, the extent of Napoleonic reform was so large and wide that it helped to bring down the old traditional structure of France and other parts of Europe. So that's suggesting that De Las Casas sees Napoleonic reform as almost complete, rather than just partial or favorable to certain groups and other things. So here you could see De Las Casas certainly arguing with or being challenged by historians like Lefebvre, Bonnie Smith, and so on, who argue that there were serious limitations to Napoleonic reform, who it benefited, who it left out, and so on. So there's a few ways you might begin to think of linking this source into those debates. I think you've got a fair bit of detail in some of the key questions and key issues that you're being asked to deal with. And you can probably expand this by just thinking a little bit more specifically about some of the issues, I should say some of the historians that might challenge and debate De Las Casas. That would help you, I think, begin to expand your analysis of him as a source.